Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone already managed to get some coffee from upstairs. We're going to kickstart the second day of this really, really fascinating seminar gathering of experts in the field of pesticides. Try to do it more or less on time because I've noticed that you have a pretty tight schedule of very interesting discussions ahead. On behalf of the Institute for European Studies and our Jean Monnet Center on EUMERGENCIES, I would like to thank the organizers, Marta, Alessandra, Antoine, also for inviting us to chair these panels and to read these really, really interesting papers. It's not our academic let's say, home or zone of comfort, and it's really fascinating to be able to also participate a bit in these discussions. I heard that you had very, very already interesting debates yesterday, so I guess you can follow up on it also today. This first panel today is on the role of the regulated industry in pesticide governance, and we have two speakers, Alice Livingstone-Ortolani from the University of Sussex, and David Demortin, from Research Director at the INRAE, Institut National de Recherche pour l'Agriculture, l'Alimentation et l'Environnement. Read two papers exactly on these issues. For the sake of time and to allow everyone to also pitch in with the discussions, I will try to cough loudly and to sign profusely to make sure that you stick to 15 minutes so that we can discuss. And on this note, I would say that we would start with Alice with her very interesting paper on access and agency in the pesticide regulatory ecosystem, an effort in of itself to bring a bit of coherence to a very broad field. And Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to try and keep it to the time. It's a lot of data, so bear with me if sometimes I speak faster, or I try to skip some of the. Please, the next slide. Thanks. So the first things that I wanted to try in is about thinking in system. So try and understand the context of regulatory settings. So the actors involved and all the artifacts and the interrelation and interdependency, and bring them together. This is because this is something that we do in innovation studies to try and understand how innovation works and how the different roles and the governance of the different roles of the different actors happens, and beyond some sort of reductive linear models. But regulation has never been sort of looked into this way. It's mostly been looked into as a corollary of innovation, like how regulation can help or not help or hinder innovation, or as an organizational, national entity. So in this case, I'm trying to bring together multiple layers, multiple actor, institution, and artifacts, and capture what is sometimes called multiplexity of relationships and interdependency. I want to make a point that regulation has a maintenance. I want to focus on what it is, a maintenance role, which is not concerned with the inherent nature of the product, the regulated product, but mostly with the interaction of the product with the rest, with the environment, human health and the environment, and whether these interactions comply with predefined socio-technical arrangements, which sometimes we call law, sometimes we call regulation, sometimes we call expectation, but essentially that is the role of the regulatory ecosystem. So I'm also using the biological metaphor of the ecosystem because it's slightly different of a regular system. It's highlighting the dynamic and the blurring boundaries, and also the heterogeneity of actors, so private, public, and other type of actors like activists or social actors, and the lack of strong hierarchical structure. I'm going to try and explain that, but it's not easy with 15 minutes of time. So essentially, next slide, sorry. So the conflict network forming dynamic is what I want to show. I would have liked to have a diagram that looked more like this, but I don't have the founds. So it looks more like the next slide, which I did. So it's very simplistic, but that shows, so the green layer is basically the epistemic contribution. You would be there, essentially. So it's all from academic journals, private scientific services, specialized media, individual toxicologists, all of that contribution of knowledge forming environment. The middle layer is the national layer. I would like to again say that this is not the way the system is. This is a very simplified version that I have to do to make you understand more or less. So the regulatory agency are in this kind of layer. So is the national entity responsible for regulatory management. And then there is the international layer. A lot of entities and institutions and ad hoc meeting, thematic conventions, all of which have one role or another on the eventual regulatory settings. And then there is that little circle over there that is not being explored so much, which is the informal fora, Society of Toxicology, international conferences. It's kind of in-betweener between the green layer, international layer, and the national layer. It's a sort of expert meetings. That has a role in itself that has not been explored, but the industry knows the role that it has, and it's using it quite a lot. Please, can you? So then I checked the various axes and agency, not just the first one, please. So that's the civil society, NGOs, axis and agency, and that's the axis and agency of academics, specialized academics. As you can see, there is a limitation on entry points for the various actors. In some cases, there is access, but not a real substantial agency, or at least if there is agency, is circumstantial. So you can eventually, with a trial or with a successful campaign, have some form of interaction, but is not systemic, is not inherent in the system. Then the next one, please. And that's what the industry has. Essentially, what you're seeing here is a looking glass of the regulatory ecosystem. They have created enough structures to mirror at every single entry point. Not only they have access to the current institution, but they have created parent institutions, or symbiotic institution. Take the OECD, and you will have the business, the BIAC, the business. Take the lobby firms, and you will have CropLife. The political firms, and then you have the lobby. Take the academics, and you will have ILSI. You will have their own academics, their own think tanks. So they have a sort of mirror image of the system. So next one, thanks. So very quickly, I'm trying to understand what is imbalance coming from, and if there is a structural bias, and what it is, how do they manage to capture value? Next one, please. So the structural bias comes from my historical research on pesticide legislation. So early regulation was created because the industry wanted as a market instrument to control new entrances, essentially. And so it was created within the pesticide subsystem. So agriculturalist, politician relevant to that, and the industry. And it was based on the economic and technical supremacy narrative. So it was mostly American, because they were the one after the war to have the amount of economic power and technical supremacy to impose on others. We catch up very quickly in Europe. At that time, the term was not pesticide, was not plant protection product, was economic poisons. It was very clear as a term. And they were users of economic poisons because it was an utilitarian trade-off intended to specifically said that there was a risk of poison and there was the benefit, economics. But then it got muddled through plant protection product. Institutional clientelism was the initial approach, agency ratified marketing. With every time that there was the product was presented, it was simply ratified, and that's when it started the innocent until proven otherwise narrative, which is incredibly resilient, I must say, and keep the product in the market. There were also legal kind of instruments to keep the product in the market, which were essentially punishing financially the agency if they sort of limit the market access. The other one is harmonization along project, long-term project, still are going on now, which had to do, initially was started among states in the United States, then it was brought to the OECD with minimum data in the 1980s, and it was connected to trade and administrative and economic efficiency, national and international. So let's cut the red tape, as they call it now. So there was an unbalanced workload. So the regulators were, since day one, flooded with product, and they had limited resources, limited time frame. And here comes the invention of the active ingredient, a simplifier for the regulators not to have to deal with thousands and thousands of products. And they kept it very, very jealously. It has no scientific grounding. Uncertainty in information asymmetries then crept in during the ages, especially when environmentalists came in. But utilitarianism remained. So the result was a language of containment, what you call now risk. Hazard, any point of hazard had to be repeatedly dealt with ignoring it, like, for example, the Delaney clause, or creating new containment language like de minimis, threshold of toxicological concern, etc., and then, or more recently and continuously, conflate hazard with risk in risk assessment. So it is impossible to a policymaker to make the difference. So if you have an hazard regulation, like we do in the EU, there isn't a regulator, they're not presented with a real hazard. The ECHA report is based on the EFSA report on glyphosate. So on the same data, there is not a clear separation of what is the hazard and what is the risk. It's not very clearly defined, and especially inside single studies, this is even more evident. The epistemic view from the lab created also with the collaboration of the first regulatory toxicology. I call it Pax Toxicologica. You know what is called the alphabet soup, it's ADI, NOAL, OAL, all those kind of threshold and abbreviation that helped the language of containment, essentially. This is because toxicologists initially tried to mention things like maybe there are no threshold for cancer, but they were told this is not negotiable, and they created this kind of, okay, let's meet you both ways, essentially. And since then, that has continued. International regulation for international trade and international cooperation means the marginalization of plurality in favor of what is called predictability. Thank you. The next one is, so as I said, the industry has a looking glass system encompassing the entire system. So I compiled the literature and I created a taxonomy of strategy based on separated on epistemic, institutional, cultural, and political. I'm not going sort of through the definition. I'm sure you you can see it. Sorry, it's like I'm running out of time. The next one. So this is what it came out. So this is based on existing literature that I'm sure most of you have read. Essentially, these are different tactics that have been used. I call it epistemic, but I'm sure some of this you can agree they are also institutional. And these are like strategies that have been used by several other, not only pesticide, tobacco, pharmaceutical, and other. So, if, for example, shape the evidence through funding and undertaking safe research, which I think we talked about it, or withholding evidence, damage control, more sort of heavy-handed practices like ghost designing, ghost writing, the manager of interpretation of study results. But also there is one that is kind of like the defense tactic, then there's the more attack tactic. Why toxicologists don't want to involve themselves with the regulation? Well, because they are savagely attacked. Their reputation can be destroyed by, as we saw with Gilles Lalini or others, Blair in the United States, Portier, and others. So the next one. These are institutional. They're mainly based on institutional characteristic, like institutional inertia. When you take a decision, then you have to stick with it. If you approve a product for 10 years, like you did 20 years, 40 years, like you did with glyphosate, and then you're met with new evidence, it means you've made a massive mistake. And they will not accept that, and the industry knows that. So it's going to use that pressure point on them in many, many different ways. But they also have people inside, constant access, they have leverage, they use revolving doors, they have, I believe, almost all, you said that, almost all the APA administrator ended up working with the industry in the end. So that's kind of like what happens. They offer also career exchange opportunities, they offer much higher salaries and a lot of meetings, a pen, a coffee, a barbecue, come with us, and all of that, and then we'll teach you about the mode of action, the mode, etc., and all our nice theories. And the next one, so the cultural. This is a new and advancing strategy. This uses heavily new media. They have an incredible array of legal and illegal strategies, or barely legal. They have consultancy. They have what you call the websites, influencers. They pay influencers. They have apparently scientific media website. They all create this narrative, what you call the guardians of reason. And they all are geared towards trying to depict their science as the best science, and the other science as you may have heard, junk science, or sort of not good science, and or politicized science, and all of that, as if all of this was not political. Then they have. Please consider the last line. This is so important. Forecasting future. They have a strong narrative on how this is the only way forward. Tina, there is no alternative. They have promotion of future result and societal gain, high efficiency and improvement are highlighted, and all the other non-good things like, resistance, herbicide resistance, and all of that are put under a carpet. This is so important for politicians, very much. Next slide.
Sorry, this is a bit over time.
Oh, already. Oh, great. Amazing. Well, man. Okay, so just next slide, and I'll So there is the political strategy. I can show you the thing. But essentially what I want to say is that they have a use of time. They're trying to, use the time on their favor, as they are first comers, they have historical present, they can employ multiple strategy at the same time, and they can stress institutional actor for the lack of sort of keeping time, like myself. And then these are like summaries of strategies. They have defensive strategy, the usual deny, defend, delay, inoculate key stakeholder, defend the product, and then delay when they are requested evidence up until like 10, 20 years, if more. Aggressive tactic, I spoke about it a bit, and they have system-wide tactic. The important thing is that all these tactics have been found in the glyphosate case, like the many slides after that said. And can I bring you to the last slide, the 19th slide? All of that and examples. Yes, exactly. So what I said is that multiplexity shows that single top-down policy reforms are not possible, and they're not probably working very well. And utilitarian trade-off is asymmetrical distributed, meaning that there is environmental injustice, and there is an ineffective regulatory ecosystem. My solution would be plural, spontaneous, and organized coalitions, such as the one that I've sort of talked about it here, to have a more democratic sort of reaction to this. And I'm happy to talk about it in another moment, but I'm also, of course, sort of happy to see any national sort of solution to this. And sorry about... Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, for sticking to the challenge. I think it was difficult to do in 15 minutes, and doing it in 20 is already a remarkable feat.
Okay.
We'll now pass the floor to David, whose paper, Global Epistemic Capture, How the Mode of Action and Human Relevance Criteria of Pesticide Approval Landed in Europe. I found brilliant, but also equally frightening. So I look forward to the presentation.
Perfect. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Antoine, Marta, Alessandra, for bringing us together and continue. There's a number of conversations that ongoing in this sort of area of, I don't know, perhaps critical regulatory research or something like that, with all the minds that are needed to do this. So this paper, I'm going to say the same thing that Alice, but just telling you one story about mode of action and the assessment of modes of action of pesticides in the EU, well, internationally, really, and about whether this is a case of capture. That will be the offered the conclusion I offer. So, without further ado, we all know, with the caveat that Alice introduced about this unclear distinction between hazard risks, that the EU regulation of pesticides is hazard-based. This was mentioned yesterday. If your product is shown to be carcinogenic, it can't be put on the market. If it's classified at certain levels in the carcinogenic classification, it can't be put on the market. But and that's the puzzle. We have the pesticides regulation, but we have the classification regulation that provides a way to actually go around that sort of hazard classification. And the classification regulation says if there is scientific evidence that the mechanism or the mode of action of the substance is not relevant to humans, meaning if the tumors that have been observed in animal studies don't verify in humans, then even though it's the product is hazardous, we can let it go on the market. Basically, that's so. The puzzle is, why do we have a hazard-based regulation and built-in sort of loopholes thanks to another piece of legislation? So, so how was that how is that particular line sort of installed in EU law and in EU regulatory practice is the sort of puzzle. And again, the proposed argument is that there's some this is the result of a form of epistemic capture. I won't talk about very much capture actually, but I'll get to that as a conclusion, and we can discuss it in around a cup of coffee, I guess. So first, I'll go back to what is a mode of action, because we all, in those areas, we all need a lot of pedagogy and learning. So mode of action assessment, there is a sort of broad agreement from a number of organizations, EPA, US National Academies of Science, IPCS, I'll talk about that more, but also the American Chemistry Council. You can collect documents, and I mean, they converge towards the idea that a mode of action information describes key events, key biological events, let's say, and processes that explain the overall development of a toxic effect. And you have an image of coming from one of the earlier documents produced by the EPA about mode of action in the early 1980s, saying, well, you can actually classify a substance in one principal mode of action. And you can actually analyze cancer in that way. There's cancer risk assessment, but cancer, happens through different routes or modes of action. That's the idea. Mode of action research is very useful for firms, but for regulators too, because it's a methodology that helps prove that a substance will not be active in humans. So research on modes of action has translated over the years into the identification of modes of action that are specific to animal organisms. You have a few here on the slide, but that do not happen or verify in humans. So if an applicant can prove that its substance corresponds to one of these modes of action, then it will be saving its substance, let's say. How do you study mode of action? I don't have time to go into this, but here you have a quote from an interview with an industry scientist who was, well, nicely and naively explaining to me how they do this. It's about packaging all sorts of in vitro, in vivo studies. It's a process of investigation and of packaging of different kinds of toxicological data into what they call, he calls that a package. Another more critical consultant in the area was calling that a narrative. You build a narrative about how the substance causes the toxicity it causes, and offer that or sell that to your regulator. So mode of action assessment and this assessment of the relevance of toxicity in humans is put in practice. I will not go through all of this, but I've looked at the different pesticides that have been assessed by EFSA using that particular kind of entry, that particular methodology, and here you have a few examples. Mostly, when EFSA checks the human relevance of a mode of action, it concludes that there's a lack of human relevance. Therefore, it seems like structurally the application of the method leads to the conclusion that, there's no human relevance, and therefore the substance can, even despite the tumors observed, can be approved. So now that I've explained a little bit more what mode of action assessment was and human relevance assessment was, the story. So if you look at EFSA and ECHA and their use of MOA and mode of action, they would refer to one piece of guidance that has become the standard in the area, and it comes from the International Program for Chemical Safety of the WHO, and it's mostly the authoritative and only source for how to conduct mode of action assessment, because I don't know if you realize, but the classification regulation that I quoted earlier doesn't say how do you assess mode of action. What's a mode of action? Doesn't say all of this. So regulators need some sort of methodological piece to proceed, and that's the piece they use. So it's been published in Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology by a group of authors, regulators, regulatory scientists, industry scientists. That guidance says it's not it's not science. That's one of my interviewees was saying. Portier, in fact, I think it's no, it's not.
You would say that.
Sorry. Oh, the quote isn't here. Anyway, you could call it flowchart science. It's a way of organizing data so that you manage to build a decision, a black and white situation where you say, no, we're on that side, or we're on the other side. But it's building sort of decidability. The particularity of this guidance is there's a strong assumption that a substance has one mode of action or a principal mode of action, not multiple modes of action, and that you can actually disentangle those modes of action. It's quite reductionist in a sense, because it would say a mode of action is a linear sequence of key events. I mean, it's not like entangled biological processes in the body taken as a complex biological system. It's not that. It's more of a one cause to consequence kind of event. It assumes that the discovery and the clarification of this mode of action is feasible, which is a strong assumption, because in terms of research it can be tricky to define modes of action and mechanisms. The preferred aim, as I was saying, is really excluding the possibility of human relevance. I mean, it's really sort of turned towards that, and there's a low evidence threshold, you could say. It seems to be, really, you see it in the flowchart. Human relevance of the MOA can be reasonably excluded as long as you reach that level of evidence. Then your job is done. So what's the IPCS? It's a program harbored by the World Health Organization aimed at harmonization and exchange of environmental health criteria and pesticides assessment. That's its mission. In the 1980s, post-Rio, it was chosen as the place or the platform through which harmonization of risk assessment methods would be attempted. Okay, so the IPCS, starting in the 1980s, really took up the issue of how can we solve this mess of cancer risk assessment that generates all sorts of controversies about whether cancer effects are proven or not proven, multiple controversies that I don't have time to go into in the US and then in Europe. So IPCS really took up that agenda of tidying up this mess, sort of, and attacked the issue from multiple angles, and angles that were very much often pushed forward by regulatory scientists, regulatory agencies, or industry. What's mutagenicity? Disentangling genotoxicity from non-genotoxic carcinogenicity, and you have the list of issues, and that led later to MOA. What's important to keep in mind is that mode of action assessment was first articulated at and by the US EPA to solve the controversies it was facing about its sort of initially conservative way of assessing cancer risks. It's been, as you know, attacked by industry for its supposed conservativeness. US EPA and the International Life Science Institute have worked together a lot, starting in the 1980s, to elaborate alternative methodologies, including MOA. You have a key promoter of that at the US EPA. He's called Bill Farland from the National Center for Environmental Assessment. And Bill Farland basically moved to the IPCS and took the issue and the methodology to the IPCS. And his collaborators, Cynthia Sonic-Mullin, was seconded to lead the harmonization project at the IPCS. And they took the platform with which they worked back home in the US, ILSI and other collaborators, to the IPCS to really develop and export that sort of guidance that was taking shape in the US. Looking into the archives of the IPCS was really, really instructive. The IPCS really forged its legitimacy and its sort of operations by actively looking for collaborations with industry. And so, well, every time you look at the meetings, they've set up the audiences, the agendas, and you find a clear and unhidden, assumed, traces of collaborations with ECTOC, with ILSI, which they actively invited and requested resources from, American Industrial Health Council, CIIT in the US, and also BIBRA, British Industry Biological Research Institute, where most of the meetings of the IPCS on this were held. I don't have time to go into more details, but the picture is clear. Another very important element is that John Ashby was the head of toxicology research of Syngenta, also an academic, also active in the NIEHS in the US, described to me by industry people as one of perhaps the industry guru on mutagenicity and carcinogenicity, really the one that sort of articulated this whole program of research on alternatives to the 2-year animal tests. And so John Ashby has been used as the intellectual leader by the IPCS for all of this work on leading to the development of mode of action assessment. Needless to say, no environmental, health, or transparency, anti-corruption NGOs in these settings, and nearly no academic. Or perhaps I found one academic involved, the participation of whom was paid for by ILSI. So what did they do? I mean, they tried to harmonize things, and when you hear harmonization, you need to hear to decidability, accountability limitations, so accountability control, and normative competition, imposing your standard on other possible standards. So looking at the work that they've done on mode of action, the key role was played by Better Meek, who's a regulator in Health Canada, but a frequent collaborator of ILSI and the producer of multiple guidances on, I'm doing okay with time? 15 seconds? Right. That's where the quote of Portier comes from. This is not science. Better Meek is not what this is not what she's looking for. She's looking for a flow chart. It's about providing regulatory check-off points to cover my ass. Well, if you know Portier, that's you recognize his language. But that makes the point quite clear. Harmonization, building guidance is about organizing and limiting your accountability and organizing decision making. It's not about really researching mechanisms. What's interesting was that the IPCS seemed to have pushed that work on harmonizing mode of action assessment, kind of against or in competition with HIARC, another WHO body, another body that was at the same time trying to articulate the use of mechanistic data, but really they did it in uncoordinated ways, and it seems to, there was a sort of soft competition between the two. Over time, I mean, this is the kind of network that IPCS assembled to develop the IPCS guidance. It's a mix of, still formerly academics, Alan Booby, Samuel Cohen, I have already mentioned them, some regulators and industry. Those are the authors of the mode of action piece. What the IPCS has done, or what the IPCS guidance has helped the industry do is I'll go quick. So lobby through science, lobby through publications. They sort of crowded the field with papers about how mode of action assessment can be an alternative to HIARC system of hazard classification. Their work has become central in the field of toxicology. That's bibliometric research showing how the light green cluster is really about mode of action assessment coming out of IPCS has become very central. It helped consultants develop a whole new service to companies. Here you have BIBRA, that was a research institute that became a regulatory consultancy for firms. Here you have a snapshot from their website where they say, through mode of action you can introduce in risk assessment, how would they call that? Something more nuanced to the evaluative process. That's really nicely put. And all of those publications are used as ammunitions by firms in the regulatory process. They invoke those scientific publications about mode of action to help them push their narratives about my substance is not carcinogenic in humans, even though you've observed tumors in animals. So circling back, IPCI's guidance emerged as a solution during the contentious negotiations of the new pesticide regulation, end of the 2000s in the EU, as a ready-made and useful solution to come out of the controversial assessment of carcinogenic risks. It reflects a standardization of the thinking about mechanisms and transnational embedding of the industry in this policy domain. So could be characterized as epistemic capture. This is a fantastic paper that I recommend about regulatory capture and these sort of epistemic mechanisms, how production of certain kinds of knowledge influences regulatory thinking quite deeply, and produces a situation whereby regulators or risk assessors tend to forget alternative ways of thinking about risks and toxicity, and we may well be in the front of such a case here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much also for keeping more or less on time. I know it's a bit strict and difficult to sit to it. That also gives us still 15 minutes to discuss. I'm sure the discussions continue in the coffee break, but we can also extend a bit more, obviously. The organizers tell me to extend, so I agree. I don't think we have people online, so perhaps we need a microphone. Do you want me to?
I can do it. I would like to start, Marta. So many things to say.
Thank you.
You're holding on to the microphone.
Hi, I'm Martin from Pan Europe. Thank you for both presentations. They were really great. From what you said, we also observed the same, lately, a few years ago with adverse outcome pathways in EFSA, and now it's with NAMS, where the Commission is really pushing hard, the industry is pushing hard, the animal welfare, we don't know exactly who finances them, but they're also pushing hard. And I think your research is great, but for us as NGOs, what would be also useful is to look at what's happening now, publish on what's happening now, and also write as scientists, as groups of scientists to the Commission, make it public. This would be really useful to our work because we're also working on that with limited resources. But if scientists could also, it has an influence. We see it with the neurotoxicity risk assessment, when a series of scientists, or sometimes just one, is writing a letter to the Commission, they're obliged to take it into account. So it's a request from NGOs to, if possible, to enter, of course, with your role as scientists remaining independent, but entering a little bit into the political arena and trying to push and help with your great research. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Maria Weimar, University of Amsterdam. Thank you both for fascinating talks. My questions are, I suppose, primarily for David, but maybe also for both of you. First, for David, a very concrete question. The historical analysis shows that a lot of this understanding about the mode of action assessment came up in the 1980s, 1990s, so it seems quite old in terms of science. One question that I have is, how up to date are those approaches, and how would scientists working in the field today, assuming they're independent, assess these kind of? So is there counter knowledge, or is there some sort of scientific contestation based on today's research about mode of action analysis being an outdated technique, or how is it viewed today in the light of sort of current scientific knowledge? That would be one question that I have, because it seems odd in a way that the regulatory thinking is stuck in the past. At least that is sort of what your analysis seems to suggest. That is one question. And then the other question is a bit more general, that is to both of you. where would you see the entry points in the regulatory procedure, let's say for pesticides authorization, where alternative views could come in? Because we know that there's been a lot of struggle to achieve some progress in terms of not relying only on industry science, but also allowing for public, for scientific sources that come from publicly funded science. And so there is at least an awareness at the latest since the glyphosate controversy. There's an awareness, and there's been also reform in this direction to allow different kind of science to enter the regulatory process. So not just the data that is produced by the applicants and by the industry, but also publicly funded science. So to diversify the sources. Now, where would be the entry points where a different understanding of how pesticides assessment should proceed enter in the current regulatory?
So on your first question, the one thing that really struck me was that, talking to public toxicological researchers, at least in France, about mode of action, was that they really didn't have a clue what that was. So, and that's an illustration of the, if you will, the partitioning between, perhaps toxicological research and the sort of regulatory science world. So if you talk to, at least the toxicologist I talked to was saying, so I understand the language of mechanism, okay, I do research on mechanisms, I investigate that, but what on earth is mode of action assessment? Just an illustration of the fact that it was completely foreign to them, and of the fact that only few public toxicological researchers or academics go into and engage with risk assessment and provide counter or alternative knowledge to the ones that the Alan Bubis and Sam Cohen and other of this world really take the time to develop with industry. So hence the fact that mode of action assessment is not very much challenged at the end of the day, so it can continue its course as a methodology and keeps its credibility. In terms of entry point, I've looked at the number of comments that are made in the context of public consultations on draft assessment reports organized by EFSA, as it has too. And it was very striking that, there were basically only strong multiple comments on glyphosate, and that the dozens and dozens and dozens of other processes of consultations were just not invested by scientists, NGOs, or me, or anyone, for reasons that I guess Marta is nodding has has in mind. But I guess that's official entry point. Those public consultations are established and are organized. By law, they have to, and they intervene quite early in the process, in a sense, because they're right after the composition of the assessment reports, before other steps such as peer reviewing in EFSA, and obviously commission organized discussions in SCOPAF and the likes. So. At least that's one element. It strikes me that this moment and this entry point is not very much used.
Okay. All right. Sorry. No, as you prefer. So just to pick up on that, on the outdated science, this is a very strong issue. And to quote again, our friend Chris Portier, he mentioned the fact that there is a separation that happens the career for toxicologists is slightly limited. There is regulatory and there is private. That is a big chunk of what a toxicological work does. When you enter a regulatory agency, basically you enter with an updated knowledge, but once you enter, you review the same knowledge over and over again. You review the same evidence. You are not publishing, you're not making science. You're a reviewer of science. So what happens is that your knowledge stays at the level in which you enter. Take Jesus Roland, who was the main head of OPP, responsible for the glyphosate evaluation. He had a master's degree in 1980s, and he hadn't improved his knowledge. He didn't need to. He was a career bureaucrat, essentially. That is not to say that everyone does that, but it is an issue. It is a strong issue. There has been, I don't know if you know, the key characteristic of carcinogens is, so far as I know, the only tentative outside knowledge, IARC-produced knowledge that has been tried to enter in the regulatory process. There are some others that are working a lot on trying to help somehow these scientists to enter the scientific study to be crafted in a way that regulators could accept it. There is less work for regulators to be sort of more accepting and malleable towards other type of evidence. It's just the science need to enter the mode of action. It's not mode of action anymore. Now it's adverse outcome pathway, but it's the same people. It's still Epistemic and all those people. But I think to have a sort of an entry point, you need a coalition. You can't, I think the comments are great and the individual studies are great, but you don't have the institutional backing, you don't have the coalition backing, you'll end up being phagocytated by the system. IARC managed to bring about a lot of science around glyphosate because he worked as an anchoring institution without IARC doing anything about it, but because there was that, but they said that, there is a big institution that said that my knowledge and the knowledge of fragmented capability can enter the system. At the moment, as an individual scientist, your chances are limited. The system is created to make private, financially strong labs to have the sort of the way forward, an easy access. It's not made for academics, essentially. It's my opinion. Yeah. Yes.
But that's a great point. I mean, the regulatory chorus that is organized by mode of action. Everywhere you go, talking about mode of action, you will hear the same thing because there's coalition between regulatory scientists, industry scientists, and the repetition of the whole thing in multiple places creates the standardization of the thinking. And so unless you do the same thing, it's absolutely a very important point. If you stay on your own, you just can't counter this chorus or create the alternative kind of song lines, if you like. It's really important.
I just wanted to take advantage of the fact that I have the microphone to just chip in here with the example from glyphosate itself. Regarding carcinogenicity, there was evidence of statistically significant increases in tumors, but some of them were sex-related, so more in female or more in male mice. And indeed, the test guidelines say, well, then if that is the case, then this evidence should not be discarded, but then the mode of action should be carefully examined. And so that's how they got away from it, saying, well, we don't know exactly the mode of action, cannot explain that. So basically they just discarded the problem, saying, well, we don't know actually why there should be more in male than female, so let's say it's random. And more generally also on that, there is I'm talking here with people more skilled to say that. But there was also evidence, like I said, there is evidence of oxidative stress, so a mechanism that can explain this. At some point, they said, well, that's pretty clear. And then when they discussed the statistical evidence, they said, well, even though there is some statistical evidence, well, again, the mode of action is unclear, and so we cannot conclude anything. So they use it both ways, and that's very, very problematic, I think. And this to answer also to you, of course, you shouldn't forget that in principle, the applicants are supposed to give a summary of all the peer-reviewed literature of the last 10 years, but it's usually discarded based on lack of relevance or lack of reliability, because indeed they do not comply with the criteria of regulatory science. They haven't done the work according to the test guidelines. They're not good laboratory practice compliant, and scientists don't have much of an interest. We talked about this morning, doing that kind of work, because they say no one will publish us, because that's junk science. That's outdated science. So we don't do that kind of work anymore.
I've been thinking about the reform of the General Food Law, the last one that happened after the glyphosate, the parliamentary scrutiny of glyphosate. I haven't looked at it for a long time, so I don't remember the details, but I do remember that one significant point of reform was to allow for more publicly funded science to enter the authorization process. Now, I don't remember exactly the details of it, so that's why I'm just thinking, well, why does this not do anything, or why is this not working? Why is this not? Sorry. Yeah.
Because it's not detailed.
Okay. I'm trying to organize this. Sorry, just.
Maybe we collect 2-3, so it's a final round.
Okay, but I don't have a question. I want to comment on the discussion you just had. Yeah, I wanted, both of you had, in my eyes, a quite pessimistic view on what individual scientists can contribute if you don't have a backup of an institution. And I would like to balance this a bit. Every time that we have something to say, we think, and to contribute, we reach out to EFSA and we reach out to the Commission, whoever is the most appropriate, oftentimes both. And we engage in a dialogue, and we find that this is very welcome. So we rarely feel ignored or discarded. So I think part of the problem is natural scientists and toxicologists focusing on their work, thinking, I do really good science, and then someone else should come and pick it up. And this doesn't happen so much. There's really no optimism for that. If you think you have something to contribute, you as a scientist need to make sure that it's being made accessible for societal decision making. And actually in Sweden we have this as a legal duty as academic scientists. The third task, we should make our research usable for society, and I would try to encourage as many colleagues as possible to actually do so. But it doesn't have high status. Yeah, we calculate, we count citations in scientific journals, and not this type of comments, unfortunately.
Can I say something that I appreciate very much what you're saying, and one of the suggestions that I have in the paper is that first that scientists stop concentrating on the role as a sort of just closed in the lab, and sort of consider this as a public duty, that and consider them as a sort of enacting a public service, essentially. I think this is essential, even if it means sort of not looking at themselves as just objective scientists, and understanding, yes, you are taking a position, which is a position to protect the public, and it is a political position. But I don't see anything wrong in that. I think it's wrong to think that you are neutral. That's my point of view. So I know it is a very, very strong thing to say, but I think it's useful, and at the moment it's needed. So anything that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Just very quickly, I have a question for both of you. Well, two questions for both of you. For Alice, I was wondering, so you talk about access and agency. Mm-hmm. I was wondering about agency. Do you understand it more like influence? So is it in the sense of once actors can access this decision-making or regulatory settings, they can then influence the outcomes, or is agency somewhere in between access and influence? So that was a bit one question. But I love the map. I think it's really great, and I think it helps a lot actually understanding. So it's really great. And for David, I was wondering. So in the paper, you say that the industry, that there's no industries that the capture doesn't follow from dominance or hegemony, but for more this, let's say, routine interactions that kind of establish it. And I was thinking, if we understand it like in the Gramscian sense of hegemony, I think this is really hegemony, that they really managed to make themselves the reference point in a way that is basically natural, So I was wondering, if you had any thoughts on that, because when I saw that's not necessarily hegemonic, I was like, well, actually, to me, it really sounds like it is. So, but that's more of a question. Thank you.
Yeah, partly follow on this line of thinking. A question for David is actually two questions. One is, how do you explain the difference between IARC and IPCS? Because it seems that there is a very different cultural, regulatory, epistemic environment. So how do you explain that? And as a follow-on is what do you think of institutional mechanisms like conflict of interest that I think within the WHO has changed through time, especially because of the critique, I know, with Codex. So have this mechanism led to a situation where it's more difficult for industry to have this hegemonic role? What do you think of conflict of interest? And generally, and maybe linking to what Alice was saying, okay, we have to think of strategies of resistance. That's my own rephrasing. Again, how do you see these strategies? In what type of institutional, or how could be institutional mechanisms that enable these strategies? Because we need coalition, but we do need way to enable these coalitions to emerge and be effective.
Thank you. And finally,
hello, I'm Maggie from Pesticide Action Network Europe. Yes. So thank you very much. We could have another hour or maybe a whole day discussing about this, but I just wanted to share with you that right now the new fashion is thyroid. So we see we have identified based on OECD studies, which, they're very... they take 2 years, and some of them are, you use so many animals, they're very expensive and so on. And we have guidelines. It took them years to, in the OECD guidelines, to set this up. And now the new thing is that if you see thyroid effects in rats, it's not human relevant. And I was this week in a meeting for the CLP, and they didn't. So EFSA has identified two pesticides as endocrine disruptors based on thyroid. And now the CLP, they don't want to, Bailleux doesn't say it's not human relevant. And it's interesting because if there is one only decision that they manage to change, then they refer back to that decision and they say, oh, in this RAC committee, you decided for an irrelevant case, different chemical. And then you see this becomes now, we see it everywhere, and they want to change the system. So we talk about new approach methods, which is non-animal testing, no? It's based on mode of action. And it's happening. You hear it in all committees. Now public money is spent by European Union to develop these non-animal methods with the industry. And I was exactly the same with you. When I was looking at the CLP regulation, I saw these people there. It's their principles are now in law. So we have to fight and with judges, to explain to them, yes, but this is not actual real science, so yeah.
So we have 3 seconds, right? Now, perhaps wrapping up several comments. What you describe and in a certain way, what we've tried to convey was that you have the historical construction of what you could call decision-making machines. Standard methodologies, agreed upon criteria, regulatory precedents, and to help regulatory agencies, do their work, deliver assessments, and go on, and so, this sort of ties back to Axel and Christina's work. Of course, you can come in, you can challenge that, but you need to be very politically skilled, finding the right entry points, and very resistant, fighting. In a sense, fighting the machines. I've been following a colleague in France who has really tried to push alternative thinking, alternative assessment, and so on. And she got crushed by these sort of bureaucratic decision-making machines where people go on and on again about, no, the right way to assess this is to identify the key event and this and that. And unless you sort of comply and work with in that pipeline, it's very difficult. So congrats for what you're doing, because I think it takes a lot of political skills and resistance and so on. Hegemony, hegemony could work as a term, but the hegemony is really, it's an outcome of a lot of practices and, if you like, mechanisms or modes of action. And if you think of hegemony as a result of sort of structural power and dominance, I find that unsatisfying, because you don't actually see how things actually take place and what are the mechanisms by which industry manages to do things. And it is not hegemon on its own, sort of, as you could say. As you could see here, IPCS invited industry to come over, and then industry said, well, okay, that's a really good venue for us to work in. So, this is typically the kind of mechanism that you need to put the finger on to understand how the resulting hegemony. On conflict of interest, yes. In the 1990s at IPCS, I saw declarations of interest of Sam Cohen, for instance. So fantastic, but as you know, with conflicts of interest, it works if someone uses them, publishes them, and then gets people to account. And I don't think IPCS is on the radar of people who do that. So they got away with it.
Okay, I'm going to try to be quick. So access and agency is a definition of power, essentially. So I wanted to express power, and I thought that those were useful terminology. To give you an example, metaphorically, access is looking through a window. Agency is opening the door and sitting at the table, essentially. So that is like the difference between the two. Mechanism for coalition, I wish I had. But there are some interaction, I believe, between different kind of sort of scientists and lawyers and scientists and social scientists. And I think I wouldn't count on the institution. Just to give you an example, some years ago, IARC was about to be directed by Boffetta, who was been working for the asbesto, for diesel, for all of that. If it wasn't for the great work of journalists in France, he would be there and not Kate Guton. And that would be a very different IARC, very different one. So institutions are possibly capture. The problem with conflict of interest is somebody has to look into it and somebody has to consider a conflict of interest. I went through the panel of BFR, conflict of interest declaration. They clearly mention the fact that they work for the industry. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. There's a literature on conflict of interest produced by the Cochrane Institut. Lisa Barrow work is amazing, but it shows that it doesn't work, essentially, in publication. We have to go beyond that, sort of, and consider a lot of sort of intersecting mechanism. And unfortunately, it's sort of work to keep the people to their foot, and I think people yesterday at the meeting were great and doing that. I wish I had that, but I will sign a paper with the glyphosate group at the end of the meeting, and the 25th and 26th we will make a statement on the new science, but also on regulatory things. Somebody will read it. Well, not sure. But yes, we'll see. I'm sorry about the thyroid thing. It was last time was the adjustment for multiple testing that we were working against. Every time there's a new one. It's just, that's why I try to synthesize mechanism. But I'm sorry, I don't have like a good coalition method. But I'm opening to suggestion.
Thank you so much also for finding the courage to answer the questions in such a limited amount of time. We can continue the discussion in the coffee break. We are a bit over time, but that was somewhat expected. It's a feature of Saint-Louis events. So maybe everyone could take like 10 minutes to grab a coffee upstairs, and we come back in 10 for a very interesting panel on pesticide litigation before EU and national courts. Thank you so much to the speakers and for everyone.
Thank you.